And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Pedersen, with my brothers and fellow nerds, Josh and AJ. If you're listening to this and you are a real estate agent and you haven't done your CE yet, you have 3 days or 2 weeks.
At least in Minnesota, maybe it's different.
Isn't it June 15th? Yeah, and I guess in other states, I don't know how the CE works. But in Minnesota, you should have it done by June 15th just to make it as smooth as possible. My CE is almost done. I was about to finish it yesterday, but I can only finish one course a day. So I have to go back and finish that other course that I passed yesterday. And then I can be done. Today, we are going to talk about, we're going to do kind of a lawsuit update. I had someone send me like a text message from an agent yesterday kind of explaining like the listing side broker commission, the buyer side broker commission. And I just thought we'd talk about what we're seeing as well as what we tell our sellers, what we tell our buyers, just in case anybody is still feeling like they're not explaining it correctly. If you wanted to know more about this, I mean, we did one on a podcast on this 8 months ago.
We should do like listen back to that podcast and be like, did this happen? Did this happen?
I think it happened kind of exactly how we thought it was going to happen.
A year ago, we were really nervous about this. Largely for our team, I tell people, because we have a lot of folks that run around with leads, and in those specific scenarios, the part about needing to have a contract prior to showing a house was process-wise very complicated and a little bit concerning. So they solved some of that with obviously the touring agreements, but I think just generally, I think we were a little bit nervous about what it would mean for commission rates, what it would mean for conversations that you have to have with buyers and sellers, and just making sure we had the right setup to be able to be successful there. But I won't bury the lead.
We mostly thought it was going to be just more conversations to get to the same outcome, and it feels like that's kind of what happened.
I mean, I think we did a couple different things. I'll kind of just lead into it. We did a lot of training and onboarding with our team even before we knew exactly how this process was going to go. We prepped a lot with our partners, so specifically with folks like Zillow, in terms of understanding, like, if a Zillow lead comes in, here's exactly the process our team is going to take to ensure that we follow all the rules and regulations and have the right conversations and disclosures with new clients. But also we worked really hard on ensuring that our team was educated on how to communicate this, similar to what we're kind of doing on this podcast, saying things like, here's the new way in which you're going to answer these questions, and then tracked like, what is it doing to commission rates, so that we could be thoughtful about how we communicate to seller clients, how we can communicate to buyer clients, what actually is happening through the process.
That's the biggest thing I want to go over. So the first one I want to do is buyers. So I basically just want to hear, you had someone reach out, you sit down for a meeting with them, you're about to go tour some houses. This is let's say the majority of the people listening to this podcast probably are sphere-based businesses, unless they're on our team, which we've already talked to them about Zillow. What is that conversation like? How are you explaining the buyer rep? What are the steps you take?
I mean, the buyer rep's the biggest change there. The commission piece for buyers, like you said, has kind of remained the same. We haven't really had many problems. I've had a couple conversations maybe with people who are a little bit more nervous or anxious about things, that are worried that since that buyer rep contract says a commission rate that they are responsible for, like, what if the seller doesn't pay that, and that can be, for the right personality, kind of tricky. But mostly the conversation is, hey, new regulation, we're required to have this document signed prior to stepping inside of any house. But just know we have something built into our contracts. We've talked about this on the podcast before, that basically just ties you to me working with you for any specific house that I show you. You can speed up the expiration of this contract with any notice to me, and we're good to go. I mean, we don't need to work together if you don't want to work with me. And so I think that's like I've said before, this is it was a pro-consumer. This is how this was all pitched, as a very pro-consumer. So how can we lean into the pro-consumer concept? And that was sort of what we came up with.
Well, and they said it was supposed to be pro-consumer, and then all the rule changes came out, and you looked at it and you thought, it's a little weird to say pro-consumer and then force somebody to sign a contract with somebody in order just to step inside of a house, because we felt like that wasn't very pro-consumer, and actually how it happened prior.
Yeah, I mean,
Hit or miss.
I think the lawyers all got together and they were like, what can we do here? And they kind of tried to play the scenarios out in their head, but I don't know necessarily, and maybe I'm wrong, if there were enough people that actually practice real estate that were coming up with ideas and concepts for how this played out.
I believe actually, wasn't NAR the one that wanted that though, to protect the agents?
I think they probably did. But I also think, like I'm saying, I mean, I think if you would have gotten some very active buyers agents, let's just say in a room, agents that are selling 50, 60 buyers houses a year from all different parts of the country and said, hey, what do you think would happen if we did this? And then they would say, maybe we could consider doing this, and they could have all gotten together and come up with some reasonable solutions. But I think that's been an old school real estate thing for a long time, right? You've talked to buyers. I've gotten buyers that said, oh gosh, the person, they fired an agent and they didn't like working with him and they forced them to do the buyer rep. They wouldn't even show them a house until they did the buyer rep. And before these rule changes, I was always like, well, I don't know why they do that. Why wouldn't they just interview for the job on the showing, right? And now we don't really be good. Now we don't really get that opportunity anymore. We have to force them to sign it. I mean, not force them to, but they need to, or their other option is that they just can't see the house. So it's a really fascinating reality. And I think to your point, Luke, you're not wrong. It did in some regard just make things a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, what I like about it, and this is coming from a place now in hindsight, right? Because when this was all happening, I thought, when they announced the contract piece, especially when it was coinciding with all of the headlines about sellers won't pay buyers agents anymore, that there was going to be a lot of confusion and friction. And there was for a few months, less than I thought there would be. But now that we're farther along in this process, I think there's less news headlines that are corresponding with questions specifically from buyers. But what I tell every person I interact with is it's good now that I have to communicate with you how a buyer's agent gets paid, right? So more transparency for you as a buyer is important, because at the end of the day, there's money that's going to me as a buyer's agent, there's money that's going to the seller's agent, and that's important that you're aware of that. I then say, I didn't used to make anyone sign a buyer representation contract with me until they're at the stage of making an offer. The reason for that is I feel strongly that if my services do not provide you with what you need, that you should have the opportunity to work with somebody else who's going to give you what you need. So in the past, I've been like, we're kind of not on a contract here. You run around, see whatever you want. If you like me, you're going to keep working with me. If you don't like me, I don't want you to feel obligated to. So that has changed now because of these rules and regulations. I have to have something in writing that says, I'm working with you. I can show you houses. Otherwise, I can't walk you in the door. But I'm also going to put that stipulation AJ talked about at the bottom, saying if buyer would like to cancel this or expire this contract at any point in time, buyer can do so unilaterally with written communication. So, and then I can make a little joke, say if you decide you don't like me, just write me an email saying I don't like you anymore, and then you're no longer obligated to work with me. It does say how I get paid. I will talk to you about that. Just know that there's also a line in the purchase agreement where I can write in the commission into the purchase agreement. So there's a way to offset that where you wouldn't be bringing that cash directly to the closing. In the event that a seller says, no, I'm not paying him, we can reassess and evaluate how you'd want to make an offer if that money has to come out of your own pocket.
The only other scripting that I would just because AJ did touch on it is the person who's going, well, what if the sellers are not going to offer anything? The biggest thing I tell all of my people at the time of signing that contract is I just say, here's the deal. This was supposed to be super consumer friendly. My only rule for my business is I don't want this to ever affect anybody ever being able to buy the house they want to buy. And I have not had issues since August 15th doing that. And I don't foresee having issues in the future because I'm just going to figure out what that's going to look like. And everybody is always like, okay, that sounds good.
It's
and
a math.
We get
it's a math
offer and we just put it on line 406.
Yeah, it's a math problem at the end of the day, and it always has been a math problem. We've sent out net sheets for sellers I've sent them out for an entire decade. And they've included something about the buyer and about the listing. It's been in there. And then when they say they don't want to pay it, most of the time, if you look at it for how long that it's been perpetuating with the seller, most of the time paying the buyer's agent, it's always been a math problem, and it will continue to be. So most of the time, that's just out of pride and too much watching the news when they do that, because if they were strategic about it, they would say you could either pay this and we'd pay the buyer's agent, or you could pay this and we're not paying the buyer's agent. It should be about the same number. Same amount.
So that's a good segue into the seller side of this. The first thing to know from a seller side, and we'll talk about the scripting. I want you guys to say kind of what you do when you talk to sellers about. The biggest thing to understand is that, and I think a lot of brokerages are finally starting to adopt this way of doing it, but from the start, our brokerage EXP has not has stated we're not going to provide cooperating commission. So how we do this might be a little bit different than other brokerages just because of that fact. But how do you explain this to sellers, and what does that look like?
When the lawsuit came out, all the headlines kind of read, and the intent of a lot of what they were doing were trying to separate how commissions were paid. So a buyer would pay a buyer's agent, a seller would pay a seller's agent. The challenge in that world is that a lot of buyers are in a position where they don't have a lot of cash to just pony up that extra funding. And so historically, the way it's always worked is sellers have, because they've had equity, been able to pay the commissions for both the buyers and the seller's agents and offer that compensation from that position of equity. And then the buyers have essentially funded it through their mortgage by, putting down more, paying more for the house, et cetera. What we now have the opportunity to do is not be as we don't have to say, here's what we're paying. In the past, we had to say, buyer's agent commission is X. It's 2, it's 3, it's 2.7, whatever it is. And we would market and advertise that. That's no longer part of the process. We don't put that number out anywhere. I would like to sign a separate document with you that talks about what you're comfortable paying and gives me the opportunity to talk about it in the event that someone is not willing to see the house unless they know exactly what that number is. But for the most part, my approach will be to say commissions are negotiable. They've always been negotiable. Write it into the purchase agreement if you want to. And then we'll look at it from a net basis. So as a seller, your goal is to say, how do I get the most money? It doesn't matter if I'm paying 3% out or 2% out. If one offer's higher, I'm just looking at a net number. And so as a seller, I would approach this with, what you're paying me. This is what I charge for my services to list your property. I can give you an expectation of what you will see in terms of expectations from the buyer's agents and what those commission rates will look like. But what we'll do is we'll collect data, we'll get offers or we'll get an offer, and then we'll look at the total net payout and we'll work from there to make sure that makes sense for you.
And I tell every seller, I'm like, here's the deal. We're not doing a cooperating compensation. My listing fee is this. That's you're going to see on your contract. You're not going to see how much we're paying that buyer. And I haven't even been using the concessions
I just
amendment to be
doc.
often.
Oh, really? I'm still using it.
It's fine. It's a good expectation setter. I just tell the sellers, I'm like, hey, you can expect that the majority of the deals we're seeing turned in are between 2.5 to 3%. Everything's negotiable. You can negotiate up, down, left, right, whatever with that. But then we do include it in a net sheet that there's a spot for a buyer's agent commission. And when I get that question, Josh, that's sort of how I answer it. Is I say, and I don't give numbers, but I say I've prepared the seller that the large majority of buyers and buyer's agents are going to be requesting that the fee for that buyer's agent gets paid by the seller. So they're fully aware of what it is. We don't have a set number, so just put whatever number you guys feel comfortable with on line 406 in the contract. And we're not, this isn't going to be like we're going to come back to you and say no, 0. Like I've already talked to them about it. It's just we don't have a set number in place.
I just say we're open to it. Just put it on 406.
The only concern I have with that is I have
8 words.
Yeah, and it's the irony of this whole situation, right? Because I think the thought process when we did this was, we'll make everyone pay for their own thing because that was the issue with the law that started the lawsuit, right? So sellers were complaining they're paying buyer's agents. They sued, they won.
The sellers' brokers in Missouri were taking 6% or whatever it was from the sellers, and then they were cutting a check to the buyer's broker after closing, and no one was seeing how much.
But at a high level, the concern was the sellers were paying for something that they didn't feel like they should be paying
and they
for.
had no idea how much it was.
The irony of the whole thing is that now that we have kind of put this back into the hands of agents having conversations with their clients, we've actually seen the numbers play out they've stayed more resilient in terms of commission rates.
Yeah.
So we were seeing, because we tracked the data, we were tracking all the data on the MLS. We were seeing commission rates compress. So we were seeing buyer's agents commission payouts going more frequently from 2.7 to 2.5. And most buyer's agents were just accepting that. They weren't saying, hey, give me the extra 0.2 that I was getting in the past. This is Minnesota specific data. But now I think when the agent essentially sets their rate, talks to their buyer and says, we're going to put that into the contract, 2.7 is becoming a more resilient number that is more frequently seen.
Or even 3.
That's my concern with not telling them my rates. If I'm in a single offer situation is if I have no other offers and someone says, what's the commission payout? And I say, well, put whatever you want. I think I'm more likely to get 3
maybe
than I'm likely to get 2.7. And so I'm thoughtful about when I communicate that and when I don't versus just making it really open-ended. if you're in multiples, you might see someone come down to 2.5. So it's a little bit more, it gives you a strategic opportunity as a listing agent to communicate that. But I've been thoughtful about, it's like anything else. I use this line a lot. Flip the perspective. Think about it from the other side of this. From the buyer's side, from the buyer's agent side, is how are they going to respond to the things that you're thinking, doing, saying? And that's where I've kind of looked at that and been like, well, sometimes I'll just be like, it's 2.7. Other times I'll say, yeah, it's negotiable. They have an expectation range, kind of some of the lines that AJ gave, but it varies from situation to situation for me.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of doing it for sure. It's just been interesting to see the whole thing play out in the way that it has. And I think your point about commissions sometimes being even higher than 2.7.
Yep.
Like the reason why, and it's the same reason why we always try to get buyers out of a house to have a conversation about buying a house, because before it was like the commission rate was set. There wasn't a whole bunch of conversation around it. Well, now when the conversation's happening, it's way before they even show a house. So it's a less frantic type thing. It's like we agreed on this, 2 months ago before we ever walked in a door. So it's a separate conversation. I think that's where some buyers agents are saying that I should get paid 3%, or 2.7 rather than 2.5 or whatever that is. Cause it's not a part of the offer until we get to the point of making an offer,
Yeah. My frustration with that is if you're a buyer's agent and you've been getting paid 2.7 and now you see an opportunity to either like raise your rate a little bit or like sneak a couple just make sure if you're thinking about this, that you're thinking about it from someone else's perspective and not from your own personal self-interest.
For sure.
And that's where I've always said, like, the agents that are going to win in the long term in this industry are the ones that are less worried about themselves and more worried about their clients. So someone who does what Luke says and they're like, yeah, they won't budge, right? They're going to pay 2.3. And Luke goes, okay, I'll get you into a house. Like, I'll eat it. I told you I would. I'll be truthful to you. I'll be honest with you. He's going to get way more business in the back end than someone else is like, no, I told you my rate was 3. You're paying that 0.7. You're never getting a referral if you do that, right? So I just think you need to continue to think about it from their perspective. And the only thing that I don't like that I've seen from this is, you hear about, I heard a story the other day. Someone said, hey, they had the conversation, right? What's the rate? The agent says, I don't know. Like, I don't know, but like, it's negotiable. The buyer's agent then writes an offer at 3. And the agent goes, well, hold on. Like, that's not what we were going to do. And, expectation setting is important on both sides. And then the buyer's agent comes back and says, well, what about 2.7? And I just heard that and I was like, well, so this guy heard the rates were negotiable and just like pumped a high number just to try to get extra money, even though 2.7 was actually the expectation. That's where like greed comes into play, that in a way that I don't think that we should be approaching it that way as agents.
I think that's great
point.
The outside of that being the last thing, the last tip that I would have for you, if you have not read the contracts and you are not able to go line by line with a client and explain the contract to them, you should do that today. That's all we have on the Nerdy Agent Podcast. And as always, remember, be better.
Bye-bye.